Tank killers, tank hunters, tank destroyers. Whatever you call them, the tracked monsters designed to obliterate enemy tanks during World War II were seriously impressive machines. Masters at ambushing and killing traditional tanks, they came into their own in the war in Europe. Though they didn't necessarily pioneer the concept, the Germans took the idea further than any other country, and many of their tank destroyers became legends. That said, the Brits, Americans, French, Russians, and Italians had them too. Most tank destroyers of World War II didn't have turrets, but instead featured fixed casemate superstructures. In other words, because I don't understand that, they were steel boxes on tracked chassis. This layout had a number of pros and cons. Unlike true tanks with fully rotatable turrets, tank destroyer guns had relatively small traverses, usually only between 20 and 30 degrees due to minimal interior space, which severely limited breech swing. Though their field of fire increased dramatically over long distances, it still caused serious and sometimes deadly problems during combat, because if the target was outside this cone, the whole vehicle had to be moved to line up the gun. On the plus side, tank destroyers had much lower profiles than tanks, which made them harder to see, and therefore harder to hit and kill. In addition, they often packed bigger, more potent guns than tanks, and their thick, heavily sloped frontal armor was nearly impenetrable by many cannons unless fired from dangerously close range. But perhaps most importantly, tank destroyers were generally simpler, less expensive, and quick to build. This allowed Germany to level the proverbial playing field against the Russians and Americans, both of which produced armored vehicles in far greater numbers. Out of necessity, tank destroyers did sometimes engage other tanks in pitched battles, but ambush predators by design, they relied heavily on shoot and scoot tactics. Taking out as many tanks as they could from as far away as possible, they retreated as soon as they were discovered, outnumbered, or when they were at risk of being outflanked. Now, relics of the past, more than 7 decades later, tank destroyers with heavy cannons have been replaced by all-purpose main battle tanks and lightly armored tracked and wheeled vehicles sporting guided missiles. Collectively called Panzerjägers, which just means tank hunters, the first German tank killers were Frankenstein-like machines cobbled together with chassis and cannons from existing vehicles. Armor protection was light, and crews were often forced to work, fight, and live in open compartments that were susceptible to everything from rain and snow to small arms fire, hand grenades, and well-placed Molotov cocktails. This sounds like a horrible job. Early German tank destroyers had anemic cannons, though they were continuously upgraded and sometimes fitted with far more lethal captured Soviet 76mm anti-tank guns, which were mounted onto modified chassis. These vehicles were referred to as MARDERS and NASHORNS. Later versions of these heavy hitters had high-velocity 75 and 88mm anti-tank guns, both of which had significantly longer ranges and more killing power than anything that the Allies had at the time. But though the thin-skinned MARDERS and NASHORNS could dish out the punishments, they just couldn't take it. Replacements, therefore, were badly needed. Ironically, one of Germany's most iconic tank destroyers didn't start life as a tank destroyer at all. Sturmgeschützes were a series of self-propelled artillery guns originally relegated to supporting infantry units. They were often pressed into the anti-tank role out of necessity, but thanks to their low-velocity, short-barreled cannons that barely protruded from their hulls, they weren't particularly effective at penetrating enemy armor. Based on Panzer III tank chassis, later versions had high-velocity anti-tank guns, which enabled them to function as real tank destroyers. Resulting in a design that originated in the late 1930s, the Sturmgeschütz III, or Stug 3, was about 22 feet long, 10 feet wide, and just 7 feet high. Tipping the scales at about 24 tons, each Stug was crewed by a commander, driver, gunner, and loader. Armor was between 16 and 80mm thick, and the main armament was a 75mm L-48 cannon that fired projectiles at about 2,500 feet per second, that's 750 meters a second, with a direct fire range approaching 1,500 meters. Stugs. Stugs were also fitted with at least one defensive MG-34 or MG-42 machine gun and were powered by 300 horsepower Maybach V12s paired with 6-speed transmissions. With an operation range of just 95 miles, 155 kilometers, and a top speed of 25 miles an hour, 40 kilometers an hour, their mobility wasn't great, but they were one of the most numerous, fully tracked armored fighting vehicles of the entire war. More than 10,000 Stug 3s were built, and though reliable statistics are hard to come by, some estimates suggest that in 1944 alone, they killed nearly 20,000 Allied tanks, most of which were Soviet. In some respects, Jagdpanthers, or hunting panthers, were larger versions of the Stugs, but they were never meant to be anything other than dedicated tank killers. Jagdpanthers didn't enter service until 1944, and they didn't play as crucial a role as they could have if they'd been introduced earlier and built in greater numbers. To make matters worse, during this time, the German war machine was plagued by persistent parts shortages, a lack of fuel, and young and experienced crews being thrust into roles for which they just were not properly trained. Though many of its predecessors were too heavy, too underpowered, and too lightly armored, the Jagdpanther hit on a near-perfect mix of protection, mobility, and firepower that made it a true standout. Classed as a heavy tank destroyer, the first full-size Daimler-Benz mock-up was demonstrated to Hitler and Wehrmacht bosses in late 1943, and production began in January of the following year. At 9 feet high, 11 feet wide, and 32 feet long, and weighing about 45 tons, Jagdpanthers were formidable by any standards. Encased in armor that ranged from 80mm in the front to 50 and 40mm on the side and rear respectively, they offered their crew of 5 a relatively safe and spacious fighting compartment, featuring the uber-effective 88mm Pak 43 anti-tank cannon similar to the one on the King Tiger. Jagdpanther guns were mounted in a central mantlet and capable of traversing 12 degrees to each side, firing 16-pound, 7.3-kilogram armor-piercing projectiles at nearly 3,500 feet per second, that's about 1,000 meters a second. There wasn't much armor through which they couldn't punch, sometimes from as far away as 2 kilometers under optimal conditions. Powered by Maybach gasoline V12s with nearly 700 horsepower, Jagdpanthers had relatively high power-to-rate ratios, ranges of over 124 miles, and top speed approaching 30 miles an hour. With only a few main variants, most changes and upgrades were limited to accessory parts like sights, engine covers, and gun mantlets. Originally, the main gun had a one-piece barrel, but it was later replaced with a two-piece unit due to uneven wear issues that limited its service life. Some Jagdpanthers were also fitted with textured Zimmerit finish, which was applied up until late 1944 to prevent Soviet infantrymen from sticking magnetic mines to the hull, but this was later stopped to decrease cost and speed up production. Early manufacturing targets were set at between 100 and 200 units per month, but actual production fell well short and just 415 were made before the end of the war. Jagdpanthers were encountered in the West, including at the Battle of Normandy, but they primarily served on the Eastern Front against Soviet armor. After the war, dozens were shipped to Britain and America for testing and evaluation, and one restored example is now on display at the Bovington Tank Museum in England. When it comes to truly fearsome and gargantuan World War II tank destroyers, honestly, all others pale compared to the Jagdtiger or Hunting Tiger. At nearly 72 tons and 9 feet tall, in addition to their sheer bulk, the Jagdtigers were blessed with perhaps the most effective anti-tank gun of the war, the Behemoth 128mm Pak 44 L55 that was capable of killing enemy tanks from distances exceeding 3,000 meters. Featuring prominent fixed turret-like casements, Jagdtigers looked like traditional tanks, but with armor ranging from 250mm in the front, 150mm on the hull, and 80mm on the sides and rear, they were much more heavily armored. One Achilles heel, however, was a painfully low power-to-rate ratio that resulted in limited mobility, ground pressure issues, and persistent mechanical problems that put them out of service much of the time. Operational range was between 50 and 75 miles, depending on the terrain, and top speed was just 21 miles per hour, though it was rarely achieved. Of the two prototypes introduced in 1943, one featured a Porsche-designed suspension and running gear, while the other competing model was built by Henschel. Henschel's overlapping road wheel system was ultimately widely adopted for production, though a number of Porsche vehicles saw limited service as well. The Wehrmacht originally ordered 150 Jagd Tigers, although only about 85 were built, many by forced laborers at the concentration camp at St. Valentin. Of the engagements in which they were involved, Jagd Tigers performed well, attacking formerly impenetrable bunkers, and in one case in April of 1945, knocking out nearly a dozen tanks and 30 lightly armored vehicles from approximately 4,000 meters. Though they could be disabled by well-placed rounds from Allied tanks into their tracks and suspensions, they were largely indestructible. Most losses resulted from mechanical breakdowns, scuttling when capture was imminent, and strafing from aircraft like Mustangs and P-47s. When they made their combat debut in early 1944, ISU-122s were often used as assault guns and self-propelled howitzers, but their primary role morphed into killing German tanks. The 122mm anti-tank gun was another of the most lethal anti-tank weapons of the war, but it wasn't particularly accurate, and due to shortages, crews were often forced to use high explosive instead of armor-piercing rounds. Even in 1944, the Soviets only had one armor-piercing round design available, but though high explosive shells weren't made to penetrate armor, they often packed enough mass and velocity to knock out their adversaries from great distances. As the war dragged on, Soviet crews became more proficient at their craft, and with muzzle velocities around 2,600 feet per second, in direct fire mode, 122mm projectiles were capable of penetrating about 125mm of armor at 500 yards and 85mm at 3,000 yards. Due to particularly long barrel length, however, maneuvering in urban environments was tricky. ISUs were deadly against unprotected infantry positions and reinforced fortifications, but they excelled on flat terrain where their heavy armor, low silhouettes, and powerful guns could be used to greatest effect. Weighing about 45 tons and crewed by either 4 or 5, ISUs had between 90 and 120mm of armor up front, but with power output from their 12-cylinder diesels at just 520 horsepower, they were relatively underpowered and had top speeds of just 23 miles per hour. Early designs had abysmally low rates of fire thanks to manually operated breaches, but later versions in vehicles with experienced crews and upgraded breaches could generally get off 3 or 4 shots per minute with relatively good accuracy. Including all variants, more than 2,400 units were built, and after the war, many were repurposed as self-propelled artillery, rocket launchers, and supply and recovery vehicles. Some stayed in service until the early 60s, retaining their original cannons, receiving only modest upgrades to gun sights and radios. When they were finally retired from military service, many ISUs got second leases on life as railway maintenance and Arctic transport vehicles in the northern Soviet Union. Whereas most tank destroyers of the era were low-profile turretless designs with exceptionally powerful cannons, the M10 was quite the opposite. Originally called the 3-inch gun motor carriage M10, instead M10s relied on speed and maneuverability. When production began in late 1942, it was thought tank destroyers would play an important role in halting mass German armor assaults. Despite the Allies' overwhelming numerical superiority, Army brass concluded that many concentrated tank formations would succeed in breaking through relatively thin lines, and that tank destroyers would be able to stem that flow. To that end, 80 battalions with more than 2,400 tank destroyers and towed guns were created. However, this assumption didn't pan out, and the American tank destroyer battalions saw limited use in their intended role. They did have a number of significant engagements with their German adversaries, but in the end, most units were split up and reassigned to supporting infantry. Weighing about 29 tons, just 19 feet long and standing nearly 10 feet tall, M10s were high and light by tank destroyer standards. With frontal armor just 57mm thick and open-top turrets to save weight, they were dangerously thin-skinned, and survival rates for their 5-man crew wasn't particularly good. The M10's 76.2mm cannon fired 15-pound projectiles at a mediocre 2,400 feet per second. Armor penetration was acceptable at intermediate ranges between 500 and 1,000 meters, but projectiles lacked the mass and velocity to pierce the heavy armor of most German tanks at greater distances. To counter these inherent deficiencies, crews relied largely on ambushes from concealed positions, after which they used their superior mobility to get out of range of their opponent's more powerful cannons. Power came from either a General Motors 6046 twin diesel producing 375 horsepower or a Ford gasoline V8 rated at 450 horsepower. horsepower. Though neither was particularly powerful, thanks to their minimal weight, M10s were among the fastest and most tracked vehicles of the war. Between June 1944 and May 1945, total M10 strength fluctuated between about 400 and 800 units, with monthly losses in the hundreds in September, November, and December of 1944. All told, more than 6,400 units were produced by GM and Ford in just over a year, some of which saw service as late as 1948 in the Arab-Israeli War. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching.